So, welcome to December Science Cafe, everybody. And thanks for venturing out on a really putrid night, right? I'm Ann Parson. I'm semi-retired, maybe never to retire science writer, who along with a few comrades organizes Science Cafe. Grant O'Reilly is back there. Hello, Grant. Yay, Grant. First thing to do is to thank Nick Kern and his gang who take care of Last Round. They open especially for us on Tuesdays. It's always closed. And that's a really big deal. And getting us all in here and feeding us all at once. So be patient. Heather and others, Victoria will be by. Raise your hand. Feel free to raise your hand if you need another drink, because that's how we pay them back. We get you really drunk, and you keep drinking and drinking and eating, and then they make their money, right? So, it's such a bad day. We've started a tradition of telling a science joke, and I chose one tonight to tell you about ducks. Isn't that appropriate? So the joke is, what does a subatomic duck say?
Quark, quark.
Quark, quark, quark. Oh, on to our wonderful speaker, Seth Lederman. Our guest is founder and CEO of Tonix Pharmaceuticals. Tonix operates a biologicals manufacturing facility in New Bedford at the Business Park, and I believe it's the only biopharmaceutical in the city. Yes?
I think so.
Seth actually was our guest exactly 3 years ago when he talked about next generation COVID vaccines. I suspect that somewhere in some corner at Tonix, those vaccines are being still worked on, and we can ask him about that. But tonight his topic is No Fairytale, the story behind a new FDA-approved fibromyalgia drug. I want to just quickly say, if you can't hear the speaker, you should really let them know, because it's important you hear, okay? And sometimes other noises drown people out. So. The new drug is Tonmya. Tonmya, T-O-N-M-Y-A, was approved by FDA only in mid-August, and a real triumph, because the fibromyalgia space has needed a better drug, and is the first approved in more than 15 years. It only became commercially available by prescription in the US last month. So roughly 10 million adults in the US suffer from fibromyalgia, approximately 80% of whom are women. So the potential is really vast. Seth earned his MD from Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, and prior to becoming a biopharma entrepreneur, he served as an associate professor at Columbia for 2 decades and directed basic science research in molecular immunology, laid that word, infectious diseases, and the development of therapeutics for autoimmune diseases. Seth points out it's not hard to believe that the princess from the Princess and the Pea story suffered from fibromyalgia, given her hypersensitivity, and he'll tell us that this story enters into how Tonix researchers were able to fasten upon the condition's underlying causes. So without further stalling, Seth, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, for inviting me and for putting together Science Cafe. I can tell you that I much prefer attending Science Cafe than being the dinner entertainment, but I'm going to muddle along. So, and thanks to all of you for coming out on such a rainy, horrible night. It's a real tribute to me. So the title, as Anne said, is Fibromyalgia is no fairy tale, so I want to begin with a fairy tale. So as Anne predicted, many of you remember Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale called The Princess and the Pea. Like many fairy tales, it has a hidden meaning. So let me quickly retell it, and let's see if we can find the lesson about life hidden in it. A young woman arrives at a castle on a stormy night, sounds like tonight, and claims to be a princess. The queen, without her consent, decides to test her. She places a pea under 20 mattresses and waits for morning. And the princess, as we know, does not sleep a wink. She wakes up sore and miserable. Readers in 1835 probably thought that Andersen had written a charming fable. But to a modern doctor, this reads like a case report. Today, we would say the princess had fibromyalgia. She wasn't delicate or overly sensitive by choice or because of her nobility. She was suffering from a common but invisible chronic pain condition we now call fibromyalgia. For many fibromyalgia patients today, the journey is anything but a fairy tale. So the symptoms of fibromyalgia are hypersensitivity, disturbed sleep, widespread pain, that means pain all over the body, and as Anne said, it's highly predominantly expressed in women. So basically, Hans Christian Andersen nailed it. He got all of the symptoms of fibromyalgia in this fairy tale, but he may have left out one that is commonly talked about today, often called brain fog, which is maybe the fifth important feature. But what is it? As Anne said, it affects about 10 million adults in the United States, mostly women, but men get it too. And the detection of men may be limited because, as we know, men act like men. They avoid doctors, they don't talk about their symptoms, they self-medicate with alcohol and drugs, and in some cases, they act out. So, as we said, the key symptoms of fibromyalgia are, it's a pain condition, but it has these other symptoms that can be just as problematic or more problematic. So just a few more words about fibromyalgia. It typically lasts for years or decades. The common patient archetype is a woman in her 50s who has been diagnosed after suffering for 10 years. A skillful interview usually reveals that they had been hypersensitive to pain or suffering from poor sleep for 10 years before that. So it really starts relatively early in adulthood in many people, but only gradually gets revved up and becomes fibromyalgia at about 50. One of the things that has intrigued me about fibromyalgia is that some patients experience spontaneous remission. That means that fibromyalgia can just go away. It's uncommon. It might even be rare. But I think it's very important to recognize that after a year or two of fibromyalgia, full-blown fibromyalgia, it can just go away. And when I was a doctor, I'm still kind of a doctor, but I'm a biotech doctor. But I used to always explain that to patients because it gave them hope. However rare it is, it really is something that we don't understand and can just go away. And hope is a very valuable commodity for patients. Hope is very important also for drug developers. When I was in medical school, I was very influenced by a lecture by Dr. Larry Einhorn, who developed the chemotherapy to treat testicular cancer. Before Larry Einhorn's work, testicular cancer was a death sentence for young men. They would often present with multiple metastases in their lungs, and they would relatively quickly die. After Larry Einhorn's work, it's largely curable. You may remember Lance Armstrong, there's an NFL player, a lot of people get testicular cancer, and they're basically cured by Larry Einhorn's chemotherapy regimen. But when he started tackling a problem where almost no one got better, people asked him, why are you working on this? And his answer was, because sometimes people get better. And that was true about testicular cancer. So that's the kind of hope that fibromyalgia gives to me, that if we keep hammering away at this seemingly unsolvable problem, that maybe we can have the kind of spectacular results that Larry Einhorn had. So getting back to fibromyalgia, pain is the primary symptom of fibromyalgia. For FDA trials, pain is the primary endpoint. A drug that treats fibromyalgia is called an analgesic. As an analgesic is the scientific name for a drug that reduces pain. And so what we set out to do was to develop an analgesic. But then thinking about pain, it's very important to stop and realize that acute pain and chronic pain have very little to do with each other. Acute pain is your body saying, hey, something's wrong, do something about this quickly. Take your foot off the nail, take your hand off the burning stove, pain is an alarm system that tells you to react, to preserve your tissues, and to stop doing whatever you're doing. Chronic pain is very different. It's like an alarm, a very annoying alarm, like a burglar alarm in your house or the smoke alarm that you can't turn off. It goes on and on and on, and it's exhausting. And it steals your ability to concentrate. It makes you fatigued. It has all sorts of ramifications, but it really doesn't have much to do with acute pain. One of the things that chronic pain does after a long time is it basically tells you to surrender. And that's one of the saddest things about fibromyalgia. It erodes your confidence. It stops people from fulfilling their life roles. So typical female roles might be mother, wife, professional. And it's very common for patients to say, fibromyalgia has stolen my life. So before we get into our work, it's also important to just say a little bit about opiates. It's hard to talk about pain without talking about opiates. Opiates have a recognized role in treating acute pain. If healthy people have a molar out, get a broken leg, do something like that, opiates are well established and probably useful. But opiates should never be used for chronic pain. Now, by the way, when I say chronic pain, in the pain field, we usually exclude cancer pain. So cancer pain is like a different universe. But for chronic pain, opiates shouldn't be used. And for fibromyalgia, it's actually known that opiates make fibromyalgia worse. Yet, it's an embarrassing fact of American healthcare that opiates are widely prescribed for fibromyalgia. As a matter of fact, opiates are some of the most widely used drugs in fibromyalgia, something that hopefully better drugs and a better health system will address. In fact, the ill-advised use of opiates for chronic pain is probably the single biggest factor that precipitated what we all know as America's opiate crisis. So about 25 years ago, when the opioid crisis was beginning, I set out to find something different, a non-opioid analgesic to treat fibromyalgia. A lot of people warned me about this, said it was impossible, said even if you find something that's a non-opioid, if you remove pain, it will be addictive, even if it's not an opioid. And then there were all sorts of things, all sorts of theoretical reasons why this was not a good idea. So to find a non-opioid analgesic for fibromyalgia was really a leap into the unknown. And frankly, it could have ended badly. So at the time I started, I had just been promoted to tenure as an associate professor at Columbia. And most of my work was in basic immunology, but I had been clinically trained in rheumatology. And that's the subspecialty of medicine that takes care of fibromyalgia patients. So I had many fibromyalgia patients in my practice, and fibromyalgia is something that most rheumatologists sadly kind of ignore. Nothing to do about it, many. But once you start listening to them, you start hearing things. And I was strongly motivated by a Canadian psychiatrist called Harvey Moldavsky. And I was fortunate to become friends with him. He was kind of a mentor. We collaborated, but he really taught me to listen to things. And once he got me thinking about it, I could always hear the truth in his insights in the fibromyalgia patients I was treating. So while Hans Christian Andersen used literature to pull together these aspects of fibromyalgia that are not often pulled together, Harvey Moldavsky explained it in a methodical, scientific way. In 1975, so 50 years ago, he made a bold assertion. He claimed that fibromyalgia, which I've told you is a pain disorder, he said it's really a sleep disorder. Kind of didn't make sense unless you really read what he was talking about. And what he was saying was that the sleep problem, sleep wasn't just a symptom, that sleep was a problem closer to the core, closer to the root core of fibromyalgia, but pain is what people came in complaining about. And Harvey did a very interesting experiment. I don't know if you could do this today, Canada. He enrolled undergraduates from Toronto University, University of Toronto, and he brought them to his sleep lab, and he had electrodes on their head, and every time they started to fall into a sleep pattern that he could see would be healthy, restorative sleep, he would ring a telephone. So he basically deprived them of good quality sleep. And it was a relatively small study, but Harvey really interpreted it correctly. It was beautifully done. And he concluded he was able to induce a mild form of fibromyalgia in these healthy, non-fibromyalgia undergraduates. And he was successful in all cases except one, and he took the time to note that this one patient who was resistant to developing fibromyalgia was a cross-country varsity athlete. And that's something that comes back, is that exercise is a very good preventative to fibromyalgia, and for many people it could be something as a therapeutic. But in other words, what Harvey Moldavsky did to healthy undergraduates was similar to what the princess, the queen, did to the princess, right? She put a pea under the bed, but that wouldn't work for healthy people because the princess is already hypersensitive, but he had to use a telephone to induce it. But that's an example of showing how sleep might be higher up, closer to the origin of fibromyalgia. So whether everyone, all the experts, believe that sleep is the only problem or not, everyone, I think, at this point agrees that sleep and sleep quality are that poor sleep and poor sleep quality are very important in at least exacerbations of fibromyalgia, making acute pain chronic, and a lot of other things. So when Harvey Moldavsky died in August, which we'll get to, his enduring legacy will be the connection of poor sleep quality and worsening pain. So while he convinced experts that these are related, he and other people tried to improve sleep, to improve fibromyalgia, but they weren't successful. The most obvious thing to try was Ambien, Zolpidem. And that's commonly taken. Many Americans take it. They shouldn't, but many take it with a glass of Chardonnay. But it's commonly used. It says, don't do that on the label. It's like that mattress label, don't cut this off, ever. But it turns out that Ambien doesn't help fibromyalgia. And I think that tells us something about Ambien. It increases the quantity of sleep, the amount of sleep, but it does not help and probably hurts the quality of sleep. So that's an important distinction. Quantity versus quality. So the problem with fibromyalgia patients isn't the quantity of sleep they get, it's the quality of sleep. Just another word on it, when you ask fibromyalgia, they kind of have an alertness at night. So sometimes they say, what keeps you up at night? I hear the cat walking around in the kitchen downstairs. So it's kind of like a vigilance that, that can't, be disengaged or something. Anyway, but then other people looked at another drug called sodium oxybate. And that actually had very intriguing results, and the company developing it took it to FDA, and the FDA rejected it. It's a sleep drug. It really knocks people out. It's almost like a stupor. People are really out of it. But FDA rejected it because it's also a drug that has a very bad legacy as a date rape drug. And FDA said that for a common condition of fibromyalgia, we just don't want this floating around. But for us, that was a big inspiration because it was another clue on this path that if we could address sleep quality, we could improve fibromyalgia. So then the next clue in this journey came, and in around 1990, Merck, the big pharmaceutical company, tested a daily sleep drug called cyclobenzaprine in fibromyalgia. And it was a big study, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study, and every night the patients got either the drug or the placebo, and if they got the drug, they swallowed a tablet, remember that? And the study failed. Merck canceled the program, and everyone saw it as a failed study. I looked at it and thought, well, the study didn't fail entirely. And actually, patients improved after 1 month, but there was no benefit at month 2 and month 3. But to get a drug approved for a chronic condition, you have to have a benefit at 3 months. That's just what FDA has decided is a chronic treatment. So I thought the problem was, well, maybe the glass is half full. Maybe if we look at this carefully, we can find a way to take this 1 month benefit and make it more durable. So that sounds easy, but this is where our story becomes less like a fairy tale and more like a very long, very complicated, and very expensive detective novel. So there were a number of hurdles. One was called subjective endpoints that I'll describe. The other is no animal models. The other is fibromyalgia is controversial. And the fourth is that at that time, it was largely ignored by universities. So starting this program was up against not only the hurdles of treating this invisible, complicated brain disease, but these other additional hurdles. So what do I mean by pain is subjective? The only way you know if someone has pain is they have to tell you or write it down. There's no instrument that can read the amount of pain that someone's having. So when you have something that requires a patient to talk about it or to rate it, it means that it's subjective and not objective. And generally speaking, subjective endpoints are messier. They have a higher placebo response. They require a larger number of patients in the studies. And there are all sorts of problems. Anyway, despite this problem, we thought, well, if it's important enough, it's worth it. Another problem is fibromyalgia doesn't have any animal models. How could it? A mouse can't complain about that they're not sleeping well and that they're in chronic pain. I mean, there are a lot of acute pain models in mice. You put them on hot plates, you torture them, you do whatever, but you can't, there's no real model for fibromyalgia. So that means it's very hard to find the right dose. And that came up to be something, a cross that we had to bear, so to speak, because you have to do large studies just to find out if you have the right dose. Another obstacle was that fibromyalgia was controversial. To some extent, this is a legacy of back when medicine was a patriarchy and women were, mostly the fibromyalgia patients. No one believed them. But I don't understand why it's still controversial, because for at least 25 or 30 years, there have been more women graduating from medical schools than men. There are plenty of women out there, but somehow, female doctors, but for some reason, this legacy of this kind of subculture of making fun of fibromyalgia patients still exists. You still hear well-educated, otherwise smart people going, fibromyalgia doesn't exist, or fibromyalgia is a made-up indication, which is really not productive. But somehow we're going to hopefully tackle that with our commercial education program. Anyway, because of that controversy, I could really only work on fibromyalgia after I got tenure. But even doing that after I got tenure meant that I wasn't going to be able to hang out with the cool kids anymore. So it was some sacrifice, even on the medical school faculty. But the fourth problem was that it wasn't something that universities or the NIH cared about very much. Now, the NIH has come a long way. To some extent, universities have. There's the NIH HEAL initiative, which was great. But at that time, it was a no-go at universities. So in order to study it, I had to start a company. Anyway, so we started this company. And from 2000 to 2015, our team looked at many ideas to make this cyclobenzaprine effect more durable. Most of them didn't work. A few of them failed miserably. But we kept going, and finally we landed on a concept that seems really simple. It wasn't simple. What we decided was, if we could deliver cyclobenzaprine, the same Merck drug that failed when it was swallowed, if we could deliver it in such a way that we could put it under the tongue and it could go right into the bloodstream, maybe that would work. And we'd been studying it for years, and we'd looked at metabolites, we did all sorts of work on this, and we realized that the major metabolite, a metabolite means a new chemical that the body creates after it's chewing up the chemical that you give it. So the major metabolite was counterproductive. It actually counteracted some of the beneficial effects of cyclobenzaprine. And we realized that if we put it under the tongue, that we'd have less of that, cyclobenzaprine could do its work, and maybe we could make this 1 month benefit go to 3 months. Not every idea works, but this one did. But creating a sublingual tablet that worked was not easy. It required a lot of chemistry, a lot of engineering, but we ultimately made one. Finding the right dose, as I said before, required 2 large and very expensive failed studies, but we found the right dose. We survived failure after failure, but I think we ultimately got it right. So in December of 2020, we announced our first positive phase 3 study. In December of 2023, we announced our second positive phase 3 study. And those two studies are what you need for FDA approval. So in October of 2024, we filed the new drug application, which, by the way, is a 1 million page document. And I'm not using million like as a, conversational exaggeration. That's how big they are. Obviously electronic. And then on August 15th, so just a couple months ago, we got FDA approval. And when you get FDA approval, you get a brand name. So our brand name, as Anne said, and Anne pronounced it correctly, is Tonmya. And it took a while to get our commercial team together and everything, but actually it's just a week ago, Monday, so 8 days ago, we launched it, meaning that in theory, I don't know if you should test this, but in theory, if you have a prescription, you go to CVS, you can get our drug. Wow. Yeah. So what does this mean for patients? Hopefully, patients will ask for it and doctors will prescribe it. Hopefully, our drug will be tested by doctors and patients and everyone. And if it's successful, I think several good things can happen. One of them is that I hope fibromyalgia is diagnosed and treated earlier. Why should it wait? Why should it take 10 years to be treated? We don't tolerate that for cancer. We don't tolerate that for diabetes. It makes absolutely no sense. So for just about any condition, the earlier you treat it, the better chance you have of really changing the trajectory. Another thing is that hopefully the communications we're doing around launch and the education, the rest of it, hopefully we'll be able to have like an olive branch between doctors and patients. Because too often patients go into their doctors, the people that they're supposed to trust, and instead they're met by suspicion, disbelief. They're viewed often as, benefit-seeking, malingerers, the rest of it. Too often they're told everything looks normal, your labs are fine, maybe it's stress, maybe you're depressed, maybe you're too sensitive, etc. I think that having a new therapy and having people talk about fibromyalgia hopefully can take some of this toxic part of the dialogue out. The reality is, after all of these years, we know that these patients are not imagining their symptoms. They're not exaggerating. They're not weak. They're living with a real disorder that affects pain processing, sleep architecture, autonomic function, and quality of life. So fibromyalgia is not a fairy tale cure, but it is a FDA-approved, scientifically validated, non-opioid analgesic to treat fibromyalgia pain. Our aspirational goals are that it may help fibromyalgia patients feel like themselves again and help them regain their roles and their lives. And for a patient who has lived in this fog of exhaustion and pain, that is not a small thing. So in conclusion, fibromyalgia is no fairy tale. After 25 years of work, the approval and commercial availability of this is frankly a reward in and of itself. But the extent to which the product becomes adopted and helps people will be the real test of Harvey Moldavsky's hypothesis that poor sleep quality is close to the root of the fibromyalgia problem. And ironically, Harvey Moldavsky passed away on August 15th, the same day we got FDA approval. Anyway, part of Harvey's unfinished legacy is about exercise. As I said, Harvey recognized that even with this first patient, it's now been validated in huge studies all over the place, exercise is a great preventative of fibromyalgia, and it can be part of a multimodal treatment paradigm. So hopefully Tonmya will help a lot of people, and also hopefully it will lead to better and better drugs that target sleep quality. So ours is the first-in-class, first drug to target poor sleep quality, but the way that drugs evolve is that now that people have what's called a validated target, there can be a lot of more focused invention and testing around this model. And it's good to have a roadmap for that, because developing drugs for common chronic conditions is really, really hard. So my last comment is about The Princess and the Pea. So not surprisingly, it had a happy ending. The princess with fibromyalgia is rewarded by an arranged marriage to a prince. Despite Hans Christian Andersen's clinical diagnosis, his therapy may not be widely applicable. Clearly, as a preventative or disease management tool, the beds of fibromyalgia patients should not be sabotaged with peas, and sleep should not be interrupted by telephone ringing. Not every young fibromyalgia sufferer gets such a happy ending. Not every fibromyalgia patient wins a heteronormative, social class appropriate arranged marriage. But in fact, many married women, happily married women, continue to suffer from fibromyalgia. But Hans Christian Andersen's tale may have provided fibromyalgia sufferers with some hope. And as I said before, hope is a very valuable gift in and of itself. So thank you very much.
Wow, that was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are going to open up to questions, because I'm sure people do have those.
Tina.
So what were some of the results of your clinical trials?
The question is, what are some of the results of the clinical trials? So you can go on the web and look at the Tonmya website and the package insert and all this, but the primary endpoint was a reduction in pain. And the way that FDA wanted the primary endpoint was a statistically significant difference in mean pain at week 14. So the treated group had less pain than the placebo group. But another thing that's also on the label, package insert, is that the number of people with a 30% reduction in pain increased. And 30% is the level of pain that the key opinion leaders have called clinically meaningful. So it really checked all of the boxes on the pain endpoint. It also, and both the phase 3 studies are published in peer-reviewed journals, there also were very significant, well, I should say there were impressive changes in improvement in sleep quality and a reduction in fatigue. But those are not claims on the FDA label, because the FDA doesn't yet have validated endpoints for sleep and fatigue. So we use the endpoints that are most widely used, but it will take some time to work with FDA and key opinion leaders and whatnot, and be able to develop those kinds of endpoints for, for the label. But in the end of the day, the trifecta in fibromyalgia would be pain, sleep, and fatigue. Right, so the question was very perceptive. So it's an analgesic because the primary endpoint was pain. It treats fibromyalgia, which is a pain syndrome. But the question was, well, you're really targeting sleep. And that's true, but as I said, FDA doesn't have a measure for this kind of sleep. And the other thing is that I think the best way to think about it is kind of like it's an indirect analgesic. So instead of going directly at pain, it's going at sleep. But But that's what I meant about chronic pain being different from acute pain, because chronic pain is much more complicated. Instead of thinking about chronic pain as one thing, I think it's best to think about chronic pain as a group of related conditions like post-herpetic neuralgia, painful diabetic neuropathic pain, spinal pain, things like that. So chronic pain is best understood in terms of these syndromes. And when thinking about the syndromes, you can have a more complicated thing. For example, I don't think our drug will work in some of these other conditions. So the question was, in order to start a company, in order to do it, I had to start a company. How did I get financing? That's too painful to talk about. Let's say I ran around New York with a tin cup for years, and to some extent still do. If anything, with the pandemic, it's more on Zoom. But yeah, we just in our last, we're a public company, so in our last 10Q, we reported that our paid-in capital, it's kind of basically capital invested so far, has now exceeded $1 billion. So it's not, this is not, those ads on TV, you see the car and it goes, professional driver on a closed track, like don't try this at home. This is a lot of work. Yeah.
Why New Bedford? How did you come here?
Why did we come to New Bedford? We've been coming to New Bedford in the summers for 40 years, and we moved here in the pandemic when Manhattan looked a little bit too scary. Right, so the question is about sleep apnea. And sleep apnea is really interesting because that's, I don't know whether a drug will work in sleep apnea or not, but there are people that have sleep apnea primarily and then get fibromyalgia because the poor sleep leads to it. So actually for those patients who have fibromyalgia secondary to sleep apnea, our drug is approved. I mean, if you have fibromyalgia, one of the things that I found very interesting, I have this horrible addictive problem about watching NFL games. I don't know why I watch them, just to talk to my kids. But I saw that Shaquille O'Neal is now doing ads for J&J as their ambassador of OSA, obstructive sleep apnea. And he's got a really interesting history with it. And one of the things that they're doing, I guess J&J's, not J, Lilly, I think they just got an approval for, Mounjaro or whatever for OSA. But he talks about how with poor sleep it leads to fatigue and these other issues. So it's been, fibromyalgia is at the periphery of obstructive sleep apnea, but our drug is not going to make someone's nasal passages open up and make them breathe better. Paul.
So now, Seth, you get to pivot and become a marketer.
Is that a question or a statement? Yeah. How do you do it? So how do we do it? Okay, so we pivot and we become marketers. So we have 90 representatives around the country, and they're running around calling on healthcare providers, because it's not just doctors, nurse practitioners and other providers. And we'll see. I mean, they've been at it for, actually even before approval, they could go and tell doctors it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. But now, it's here, it's here, it's here. To prepare for the launch, 2.5 years ago, we actually bought 2 migraine drugs that were already FDA approved. But we saw that as a way of building the foundation for our commercial efforts. So we got all the state licenses, and we got contracts with payers and pharmacies and distributors and 3PLs. So I think that we're pretty prepared when I talk to our commercial team and say, is there anything that we're not doing that you want to do? And they say, no, we're doing a full launch. So it's very, very exciting. But it is one group of the company. And I think it's very important for us as the company and me as the leader of the company to emphasize we are still a development company. We still have unfinished business. as Ann mentioned, with the vaccines. We're working in organ transplant. We have a preventative for Lyme disease. We have a number of things we're working on that we're very committed to. So we're very excited about the new drug, but we hope that we can use the revenue and profit from that drug to drive our other innovation. So the question is, are there other applications for pain for our drug? Well, first of all, drug promotion is heavily regulated, and I'm the CEO of a public company that markets a drug. So the only thing I can talk about is fibromyalgia. But in theory, I think, as I said about these other chronic pain conditions, I don't think that they're as closely linked to sleep problems as fibromyalgia. So I would say that the growth or the unexpected well, first of all, the epidemiology says there are 10 million Americans with fibromyalgia. And so far, only about 3 million are diagnosed. So one thing is we have to find the missing 7 million. The other thing is that those statistics, that epidemiology, is before COVID. Now there's between 20 and 30 million long COVID patients in the United States. And from our analysis of claims data, we think that half of them may have fibromyalgia. And in June of 2024, so about 18 months ago, the National Academies of Sciences, led by a brilliant doctor, probably the most eminent doctor in the world, Harvey Feinberg, used to be the head of the School of Public Health at Harvard, was the chair of this. And they concluded that fibromyalgia is a diagnosable condition in long COVID, meaning that if someone with long COVID has widespread pain, fatigue, sleep problems, they can be prescribed our drug on label, and we'll see if they benefit. So there are a number of things like that. But I think that, we really are in a world of fibromyalgia.
Overnight.
Yeah, so thank you for telling your story. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, not a plant. No, we're just meeting now. No, yeah. Okay, good. So late 40s, I said the typical person, about 50, female, came on suddenly, misdiagnosed for many years, ultimately diagnosed by a thoughtful physician. There are 3 approved drugs. Actually, gabapentin is off-label, but Lyrica, pregabalin, is the approved version, and many people get gabapentin. It's close enough. You benefited ultimately. It sounds like you're one of the lucky ones that you did get diagnosed, you did get treated, and not only that, the last part of it was that you're at the point where you find exercise to be very helpful. And
I've just accepted my condition. That's
Yeah.
part of it too, the acceptance.
Yeah.
Anybody else have fibromyalgia?
But I don't think you accepted it so much. You're a fighter. Because a lot of times when you say to a fibromyalgia patient, you say, "Why don't you exercise?" They go, "I can't exercise." They go, "Why don't you walk a block?" They go, "How will I get back?" So you're at a stage where you've fought for it and you can do it, but exercise as part of a multimodal treatment paradigm is very important. But advances in fibromyalgia there were the 1990 criteria from the American College of Rheumatology, and then they were updated in 2016. And one of the really big advances was the 1990 criteria. I've spoken to a lot of the people in the room, and they came out with kind of mushy language. They didn't mean it this way, but a lot of people thought that fibromyalgia was called a diagnosis of exclusion. And that persisted for many years, so that if you had a positive ANA, someone would say, well, I can't really diagnose fibromyalgia because she may have lupus. And then in 2016, when they revisited the criteria, they made it very clear that fibromyalgia was not a diagnosis of exclusion. So it says in the diagnostic criteria that it can coexist with other conditions, even serious conditions, basically even conditions that cause the same symptoms. So although you don't appear to have lupus, positive ANAs happen in the population. But now, one of the most active areas in rheumatology research is with patients who have lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. They have concurrent fibromyalgia. This isn't you, but this is a whole thing. And if someone with lupus is having an exacerbation of their symptoms, doctors are increasingly becoming aware that they should figure out, is this really the lupus flaring, or is this just fibromyalgia? And as people get better about it, they're treating the exacerbations of fibromyalgia without chasing it with steroids or biologics. But with regard to the family history, yeah, I don't know. It hasn't been peer reviewed, but there's a huge genetic study called a GWAS, a genome-wide association thing on fibromyalgia, the biggest one ever done. There are 35 new markers, but family association genetics has not been fruitful so far. The only genetic association that's clear is having 2 X chromosomes. That's, okay. I think, is this the last question? Question. If fibromyalgia is a central sensitization problem affecting the limbic area of the brain, what do you think of retraining programs like DNRS? So there are a lot of words to unpack there, but remember I said the princess was hypersensitive, that's why she felt the pee. So that's the medical term for that mechanism is now called central sensitization. Central refers to the brain, the central nervous system, and it's actually hypersensitive not only to touch, like the princess, but to all the other 4 senses. So smell, taste, sound, and all the rest. So central sensitization means everything is sensitive, and so if it is, so let me go to this question. What do I think about brain retraining? Well, as I said, I think that fibromyalgia can go into remission. So my hope is that if people are better treated, maybe we're going to increase the rate of going into remission. And that we've just heard a patient testimony that, sounds like not remission, but remission-ish. I mean, you can get a lot done. So I think that exercise and other things, multimodal treatment is good. But I don't actually know about DNRS, so I'm not quick enough on my feet. Names go first. Anyway, abbreviations go before names. Yeah. So the question is there a relationship with menopause, and would our drug work for menopause? So let me say that, when I was a professor, I could make all sorts of bold assertions. And now that I'm just an executive, I just have to say what the professors tell me to say. And for some reason, the professors don't like to say fibromyalgia is associated with menopause. Seems to me very reasonable, and it seems like, comports with reality. But I think that what they would say is that fibromyalgia, it can be caused by many different stresses. Like actually one of the most common reasons now for fibromyalgia is breast cancer or chemotherapy for breast cancer. Another thing can be an accident, like a car accident. Another can be PTSD, where you're not even injured. So there are many different things that can lead to fibromyalgia. So fibromyalgia is like a common final pathway. So let me say that I don't know, but I would say menopause is considered one of the stresses, call it a hormonal stress. And a lot of people think, how cancer is considered the multi-hit theory. A lot of people think that if you have many of these things, they accumulate and you kind of lose your reserve. And so menopause may push people over. Because remember I said, if you look back, and we heard 2 patient testimonies about maybe their symptoms way predated this. But I don't know, we're not really motivated to go and study menopause per se. Although, if someone has fibromyalgia in the setting of menopause, our drug would be indicated. Yeah, so we're right now, one of the great things about having an approved drug is that we're having all sorts of inbound inquiries from doctors all over the country who want to do this study, that study, the other study. And we're very excited to do a lot of the studies. So I don't know, I mean, we could look at our data, but I think it's more likely that we'll get, some doctor at a major university will say, oh, can we have your drug to study? And they usually want some money. But can they, and to work around it. But question, how is our drug received by insurance payments? We have a crazy system in America where you get approved, and now we're having those discussions in earnest. Before approval, you go through a thing called the PI meetings, pre-approval information exchange, which is a heavily FDA-regulated process where you have a very choreographed dialogue with the payers. So we started that in February probably, and then the dialogue changes after approval, and then now that it's launched, we're having intensive discussions. But it's not uncommon for a drug to launch and have no insurance coverage, and that's our current state. But hopefully we'll have some kind of an update soon. I think there's interest in it, and there's back and forth about getting it insured. But we're on it. We have a whole team called Managed Access that's running around the country meeting with the different managed care groups. Anyway, thank you, Anne, and thank you all for coming.
Caroline, thank you so much. I can't believe you got the name of your drug here right after the drug's gone to pharmacy. So it's really exciting to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, awesome.
And maybe Seth will stick around. Feel free to ask more questions, have more drinks.
Really good.
Okay.
The next event is
Just getting wet.
January 6th. Our guest, Kevin Kirshner, a filmmaker, and Audrey Kirshner, his daughter, who's a freshman at Johns Hopkins, will discuss cornering malaria, a revolutionary approach. Kevin, the filmmaker, has been working for a long time with a physician at Brown on a malaria breakthrough. There's still vast amounts of kids dying of malaria, so it's really going to be interesting. And his daughter came up with a candidate drug when she was working at Brown as an intern, so it's going to be a really interesting discussion. Hope to see you then. Thank you.